Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. We love to explore some of the more fascinating battles from history, and today we're diving into a listener request, the Battle of Eylau.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one. It's not your typical Napoleonic victory.
It's not, we always picture Napoleon just, sweeping across the battlefield, securing victory after victory.
Right, just dominating.
But Eylau really gives us a different look at, a much more brutal and bloody and kind of less decisive engagement.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so interesting. It really kind of challenges that whole image of Napoleonic invincibility.
Right.
And we're talking January of 1807. So Napoleon is at the height of his power. He's aiming to reshape the map of Europe.
Wow.
He's just crushed the Prussians at Jena. But the Russians are still a very formidable foe, and they're facing off in the depths of the Polish winter.
Okay, so not exactly the ideal conditions for, a swift victory.
No, not at all.
So what is the state of Napoleon's Grand Army at this point? I imagine they're feeling the strain of all these back-to-back campaigns.
Oh, absolutely. The Grande Armée is full of veterans, hardened by years of war, but they're also exhausted.
Right.
Their far-from-home supplies are stretched thin, and the freezing temperatures are really starting to take their toll.
Yeah, that'll do it.
And this is where their new opponent, General Levin August von Bennigsen, enters the scene.
Okay.
Bennigsen is a seasoned veteran himself, over 3 decades of experience in the Russian army.
Oh.
He takes command, and he immediately launches a surprise winter offensive.
So Napoleon is caught a bit off guard here. How does he respond to Bennigsen's very unexpected move?
Well, he does what he does best. He counters with a very bold plan.
Okay.
Napoleon aims to encircle Bennigsen's army, forcing them into a hasty retreat.
Gotcha.
This sets off a grueling 5-day pursuit across the frozen Polish landscape.
Oh, wow.
The French, with Marshal Murat's cavalry leading the charge, are just relentless in their pursuit. But the Russians, commanded by the very skilled Prince Bagration, they managed to evade a decisive defeat, fighting a series of delaying actions while they're withdrawing towards their main force.
So it sounds like a very tense game of cat and mouse here.
Very much so.
Both sides kind of testing each other's limits, and this ultimately leads them to the town of Eylau.
Exactly. On February 7th, the French vanguard under Marshal Soult encounters the Russians, led by General Barclay de Tolly, who are dug in around Eylau.
Okay.
The fighting starts around dusk, focused around the town cemetery.
So the battle starts under the cover of darkness. What happens as the night unfolds?
It's brutal. Both sides suffer heavy casualties, but the French eventually manage to seize control of the cemetery.
Okay.
However, their victory is short-lived.
Oh.
General Barclay, displaying, the kind of hands-on leadership the Russians are known for, he personally leads a counterattack, even though he's seriously wounded in the process.
Wow.
The fighting rages on in the streets until late into the night, with both sides exhausted and the outcome still hanging in the balance.
This is where things take a rather dramatic turn, right? Napoleon expects the Russians to slip away during the night, but he's in for a shock at daybreak.
You could say that Napoleon, climbing up to the cemetery hill, expects to find an empty battlefield.
Right.
Instead, he's greeted by the sight of Bennigsen's entire army, around 67,000 strong, drawn up in a formidable defensive position across a 3-mile front.
Oh my gosh.
And to make matters worse, they have a massive artillery advantage with over 400 cannons ready to unleash a devastating barrage.
Wow, talk about a rude awakening.
Yeah.
So Napoleon's initial plan of encirclement has backfired. He's now outnumbered and outgunned. What is his next move?
He has to adapt and quickly.
Right.
Napoleon has about 45,000 men and 137 cannons at his disposal.
Okay.
He's expecting reinforcements from Marshal Davout's Third Corps, which would add another 15,000 men to his ranks.
Okay.
But even with those reinforcements, he's still at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
And as dawn breaks and the French troops are still scrambling into position, the Russian artillery opens up with a deafening roar.
So the Russians seize the initiative, unleashing what some historians have described as the greatest combined artillery bombardment the world had ever seen up to that point.
It was something else.
What's that like for the soldiers caught in the middle of this?
Imagine standing in a snow-covered field, the ground shaking beneath your feet, the air thick with smoke, and the smell of gunpowder.
Yeah.
The roar of hundreds of cannons firing simultaneously must have been absolutely terrifying.
Yeah. I can only imagine.
Eylau, with its wooden buildings, quickly becomes an inferno as cannonballs tear through the ranks and set fire to the town.
It's just an unimaginable scene.
Yeah.
This bombardment lasts for almost 3 hours, a brutal opening act to the main battle.
It really was.
While this is happening, what's the status of Davout's reinforcements? Are they able to get into position for that crucial flanking maneuver?
Well, Devout's arrival is timely, but it's far from smooth sailing.
Okay.
As his troops are getting into position, they're hit with a surprise cavalry charge by Prince Gallitzin's brigade. Devout's men are seasoned veterans, though, having proven themselves at the Battle of Auerstedt just a few months prior.
Yeah.
They manage to repulse the attack with disciplined musket fire. But this buys General Bagavit, who's commanding the Russian defenses in that sector, valuable time to prepare for Devout's main assault.
So despite this initial setback, Davout is still poised to strike at the Russian flank. What happens when his main attack begins?
Davout, known as the Iron Marshal for his tenacity and determination, he launches a full-scale assault around 8 in the morning.
Okay.
He finds the Russians dug in on a ridge, their positions bolstered by heavy artillery.
Oh, boy.
The fighting is intense, a brutal uphill struggle.
Yeah.
Davout's troops suffer heavy losses, around 1,500 casualties before being pushed back.
So this setback must have worried Napoleon, who's relying on Davout to outflank the Russians and break their lines. What does he do to alleviate the pressure on Davout and prevent the Russians from escaping his trap?
He decides to take a gamble. He orders Marshal Augereau's 7th Corps and General Saint-Hilaire's division to launch a frontal attack against the Russian center.
Oh, wow.
The goal is to pin down the Russians and prevent them from disengaging while Davout regroups.
Gotcha.
It's a bold move, but one that carries significant risks.
Especially considering the conditions on the battlefield. This is where the infamous snowstorm hits, right?
Yes, the timing couldn't be worse. Augereau, one of Napoleon's most experienced marshals, is actually severely ill, practically bound to his horse.
Oh.
Despite his condition, he leads his 12,000 men forward, just as a heavy snowstorm engulfs the battlefield, reducing visibility to just a few meters.
This does not sound good.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It sounds like things are about to go very badly for Augereau and his men. What happens as they advance into this blinding snowstorm?
They lose their bearings and they stumble right into the path of the ongoing artillery duel.
Oh, no.
They're essentially caught in a crossfire with both French and Russian cannons raining down fire upon them.
This is terrible.
It's a terrifying situation, and the men of Augereau's corps suffer heavy losses even before they reach the Russian lines. Then, as they near the enemy positions, the snowstorm suddenly lifts, revealing a horrifying sight.
Oh, no, this does not sound good. What do they see?
One of Augereau's divisions finds itself directly facing a line of 70 Russian cannons positioned just 30 meters away.
Oh, my gosh.
Moments later, the Russian gunners unleash a devastating volley of canister shot.
Oh, my goodness. Canister shot. For those who might not be familiar with the gruesome details of Napoleonic warfare, can you explain what that is?
Imagine a cannon firing a giant shotgun blast. Instead of a single cannonball, it fires hundreds of small metal balls spreading out like a fan and shredding anything in its path.
Oh, wow.
It's incredibly deadly at close range, especially against densely packed infantry formations.
So for Augereau's men caught out in the open like that, it's a complete massacre. What happens to the rest of his corps?
Another of Augereau's divisions manages to momentarily pierce the Russian line, but is quickly surrounded and annihilated by Russian infantry. Augereau himself is badly injured, his horse killed beneath him. The remnants of his corps are forced to retreat in disarray back through the blizzard, pursued by Russian cavalry and infantry. It's a chaotic rout. Entire units or overrun regiments swallowed whole order and discipline completely collapse.
So essentially, Augereau's attack is a complete failure, a catastrophic loss for Napoleon. This must have been a devastating blow both strategically and for the morale of the French army.
It was a disaster. In just 30 minutes, Augereau's 7th Corps is practically wiped out, suffering around 5,000 casualties. It's one of the worst battlefield disasters of the entire Napoleonic Wars.
Wow. It sounds like the battle has swung dramatically in favor of the Russians. Their artillery bombardment has inflicted heavy casualties. They've repulsed Davout's attack, and they've decimated Augereau's corps. What's Napoleon's next move? This is no longer about winning a decisive victory, but about survival, right?
Absolutely. Napoleon, witnessing this unfolding disaster from his position on the Cemetery Hill, realizes he needs to act decisively to stabilize the situation. He needs to buy time for Davout to regroup and for his center to reorganize. He turns to his most trusted cavalry commander, Marshal Murat, and orders him to launch a desperate counterattack.
Murat, the dashing cavalryman known for his flamboyant style and daring charges. What's his role in all of this?
Murat is tasked with halting the Russian advance and giving the French army a chance to recover. It's a tall order.
It sounds like it.
His horsemen are exhausted, the ground is treacherous, and they're outnumbered. But Murat, never one to shy away from a challenge, rallies his men and prepares to charge.
We'll have to leave it there for now. Join us in part 2 as we delve into Murat's desperate cavalry charge, a pivotal moment in the Battle of Eylau.
Yeah, it really is a do-or-die moment for the French. Imagine this: Murat assembles 40 squadrons of cavalry, roughly 5,000 dragoons and cuirassiers.
Wow.
They form up in the snow. The ground is so churned up they can only advance at a walking pace. But even so, it's an imposing sight, this wall of muscle and steel bearing down on the Russian lines.
So not the classic image of a cavalry charge we see in the movies.
Yeah.
Thundering across open fields.
Right, exactly.
This is a slower, more brutal kind of advance.
Yeah, the sheer size of the charge, that weight of numbers, is still incredibly intimidating.
Right.
They're not galloping, but they're relentless. General Grouchy's dragoons lead the way, pushing back that initial Russian advance. Then come Dupoul's cuirassiers, clad in their gleaming steel armor.
Wow.
And their massive horses just add to the spectacle. They find a gap in the Russian line, a weak spot between two divisions, and they smash through it,
Wow.
creating chaos, disrupting the enemy formation.
It sounds like something out of a medieval battle. These heavily armored horsemen crashing into the enemy lines.
It must have been quite a sight.
For a moment, it must have seemed like they might just sweep everything before them.
Yeah, there's this incredible momentum, this sense that the tide might be turning.
Right.
They even push close to Bennigsen's headquarters, causing quite a stir. But then a Russian battery opens fire, unleashing a devastating volley of grape shot. These are essentially small cannonballs packed together, designed to inflict maximum casualties.
Right.
Dupoul himself is mortally wounded, and the French advance falters.
So close, yet so far the momentum shifts again, and now it's Murat's cavalry that's in danger.
Yeah. The Russians, sensing an opportunity, launch a fierce counterattack. Murat orders his squadrons to regroup and withdraw, but it's a near thing.
Yeah.
The Russian 4th Division has moved to block their escape route. Murat and his horsemen are in real danger of being surrounded and wiped out.
Talk about a desperate situation. This is more than just a tactical setback. This is Napoleon's most trusted cavalry commander, the man who has spearheaded so many of his victories on the verge of being captured or killed.
It would have been a devastating loss for Napoleon, both strategically and symbolically, especially after the disaster with Augereau's corps.
Right.
He needs Murat, and he needs him now.
So what does Napoleon do? Does he just watch helplessly as his cavalry is decimated?
No, he takes another gamble. He orders Marshal Bessières to lead the cavalry of the Imperial Guard forward to rescue Murat and his beleaguered squadrons.
This is a crucial moment.
It is.
The Imperial Guard, the elite of Napoleon's army, his most trusted troops, held in reserve for only the most critical moments. This shows just how dire this situation has become. What happens when they enter the fray?
It's a dramatic scene. 2,000 of the finest horsemen in Europe ride forward through a blizzard of snow and grape shot.
Wow.
Their advance is met with cheers of "Vive l'Empereur" from the French ranks.
I bet.
These are the men who have saved the day time and time again, and their arrival on the battlefield must have been a huge boost to the morale of the French army.
I imagine it was a heart-stopping moment for those watching. They're witnessing a clash of titans, the best of the French against the best of the Russian army.
And the Imperial Guard doesn't disappoint.
Good.
They smash into the first Russian infantry square. They encounter scattering the enemy gunners and carving a path for Murat's retreating squadrons to escape.
Wow, so they saved the day.
Their intervention is decisive. They save Murat and turn the tide of the battle once again.
This intervention of the Imperial Guard, while a heroic moment, also highlights the high stakes of this battle. Napoleon is having to commit his most valuable reserves just to hold the line.
Exactly. It shows just how hard fought this battle is, how far from the decisive victories Napoleon is used to.
Right.
It's a brutal attritional fight with both sides taking heavy casualties.
So Murat and his men are saved, but at a significant cost. The French cavalry has taken a pounding. What's the impact of this charge on the overall course of the battle?
Well, the charge achieves its objective. The Russian advance is halted. The initiative swings back to Napoleon. However, it comes at a price. The French cavalry has suffered heavy losses, both in men and horses. And while the Russian advance has been checked, they are still holding their ground.
What about Davout? His corps was still out there facing heavy resistance on the Russian flank. What's happening with his attack?
Davout and his Third Corps, those heroes of Auerstedt, they are finally in position to launch a full-scale assault.
Okay.
However, the Russians have anticipated this move. They've withdrawn to a new defensive line on the Kriegberg, a commanding height that gives them excellent fields of fire for their artillery.
So Davout is facing a formidable challenge, attacking uphill against a well-entrenched enemy supported by heavy artillery.
Right.
This is a real test for his troops, even for those seasoned veterans.
It is. It's a brutal back-and-forth fight. For hours, the battle rages across the snow-covered slopes of the Krieg.
Oh, wow.
Every French advance is met with a fierce Russian counterattack.
Yeah.
Despite heavy losses, Devoe's men, supported by dragoons and St. Hilaire's division, gradually begin to push back the enemy.
It sounds like another one of those brutal wars of attrition with both sides throwing everything they have at each other. What's the turning point in this struggle for the Krieg?
Well, Bennigsen, realizing the seriousness of the situation, commits his last reserves, Kamensky's 14th Division, to try and stem the French tide.
Okay.
They manage to push the French back momentarily, but their advance is ultimately halted by concentrated French artillery fire. And when Davout renews his attack around 3 p.m., the Russian line finally breaks.
So after hours of intense fighting, Davout's attack is finally making headway. The Krieg falls to the French along with Bennigsen's headquarters. This must have felt like a decisive moment, the tide turning in Napoleon's favor.
It seemed like the Russian left flank was crumbling, and Napoleon must have sensed victory was within reach, but just when it looked like the Russians were about to break, something unexpected happened.
What happened? Did the Russians receive reinforcements? Did Napoleon make a tactical blunder?
Earlier that morning, Bennigsen, recognizing his precarious situation, had sent urgent orders to the Prussian general Anton von Lestock to join the main army with his corps as quickly as possible.
The Prussians. But they were defeated at Jena just a few months earlier. What force could they possibly muster to help the Russians at this point?
Despite their earlier defeat, the Prussians are still a force to be reckoned with, especially under the command of a Lestock, a veteran of Frederick the Great's army. He's assisted by a brilliant chief of staff, Colonel Gerhard von Scharnhorst.
So even in defeat, the Prussians still pose a threat. What happens when Lestock receives Bennigsen's plea for help?
He responds with remarkable speed. His corps, about 9,000 men strong, is located 8 miles northwest of Eylau, shadowed by Marshal Ney's 6th Corps.
What?
Ney's orders are to prevent the Prussians from linking up with the Russians, but Lestock, through skillful maneuvering and forced marches, manages to evade Ney's blocking force.
So while the main battle is raging at Eylau, we have this side drama unfolding, this desperate race against time as Lestock tries to reach the Russians before it's too late.
It's a tense situation, but Lestock and his Prussians prove up to the challenge.
Yeah.
By early afternoon, to Bennigsen's immense relief, they reach the village of Schmaditten just in time to bolster the faltering Russian left flank.
This is a dramatic turn of events. Just as Davout's attack is gaining momentum, threatening to break the Russian line, fresh Prussian troops arrive on the battlefield. How does this change the course of the battle?
Well, Lestock, seeing the desperate situation on the Russian left flank, immediately throws his troops into the attack. They hit Davout's exhausted corps hard, catching them off guard just as they're celebrating their capture of the Krieg.
Davout's men must have been at their breaking point after hours of intense fighting, first repelling that initial cavalry charge and then leading that grueling assault on the Krieg. They're probably exhausted, their ammunition running low, their ranks depleted.
Exactly. They're in no condition to face a fresh enemy assault.
Right.
They managed to fire off a few ragged volleys before breaking and fleeing before the Prussian onslaught. The Russian cavalry follows close behind, eager to exploit the breakthrough and turn the tables on their attackers.
So Davout's attack, which just moments ago seemed poised to deliver a decisive victory for Napoleon, is now stalled. What's his response to this sudden reversal of fortune? Does he have any reserves left to commit to the battle?
He's down to his last few options, Davout. With only one intact division remaining, prepares to make a last stand on the Krieg, hoping to hold off the combined Russian and Prussian assault until reinforcements arrive. He rallies his men, shouting, "The brave will find a glorious death here." It's a desperate situation, but Davout is known for his tenacity, his ability to hold his ground, even against overwhelming odds.
So the battle hangs in the balance. As dusk approaches, both sides are exhausted, but neither is willing to concede defeat. What happens in these final hours of the battle?
Luckily for Davout, the Russian and Prussian attacks are poorly coordinated, allowing his remaining artillery battery of 40 cannons to inflict heavy casualties on the advancing enemy.
Wow.
This buys him some valuable time, and as twilight descends on the battlefield, Ney's corps finally arrives pursuing the Prussians and recapturing Schladitten.
Oh.
This new threat forces Bennigsen to call off his attack on Davout's battered corps, and as darkness envelops the battlefield, the carnage of the day finally comes to an end.
It's been an incredibly dramatic day, from that initial Russian artillery bombardment to Murat's desperate cavalry charge and Davout's hard-fought struggle for the Krieg. This battle has been a roller coaster of emotions. What's the final outcome? Who can claim victory in this bloody stalemate?
It's hard to say. Both sides have fought with incredible courage and ferocity, but neither has achieved a decisive victory. The battlefield is a horrifying scene, littered with thousands of dead and wounded frozen stiff in the bitter cold. Even Marshal Ney, known for his stoicism, is shaken by the sight. "What a massacre!" he exclaims, surveying the battlefield, and without any result.
It sounds like a pyrrhic victory, at best, a battle won at such a high cost that it feels more like a defeat. We'll continue our discussion of the Battle of Eylau in Part 3. We'll explore the aftermath, the casualty figures, and the long-term implications of this brutal engagement. So we left off with that just horrifying image of the battlefield, just littered with bodies, and Marshal Ney kind of summing it up, saying, what a massacre, and really for nothing.
Yeah, it really was, one of those moments where even these hardened veterans are just shocked by the sheer brutality of it all.
And, as we try to make sense of this battle,
Yeah.
what were the actual costs? Do we have a clear picture of the casualties on both sides?
It's tough, amidst all the chaos and with the losses just so massive and the winter conditions, it's hard to get exact figures, but most historians estimate that the Russians probably suffered around 20,000 casualties.
Wow.
So that's killed, wounded, and captured.
And for the French, given how the battle unfolded with, the decimation of Augereau's corps and, the intensity of the fighting, I imagine their losses were pretty significant as well.
Yeah, they were likely even higher, maybe as many as 25,000.
Wow.
Think about that, thousands of Napoleon's veterans. These are the men who triumphed at Austerlitz, Jena. They met their end on that frozen battlefield in East Prussia.
So, a tactical victory for Napoleon in the sense that Bennigsen retreated, but a victory that came at a terrible price. It's almost a pyrrhic victory. Isn't it a victory that kind of undermines the victor in the long run?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Eylau was a shock, a brutal wake-up call, not just for Napoleon, but for the whole Grande Armée. It shattered that aura of invincibility that had kind of surrounded them.
Right,
It demonstrated that Napoleon could be challenged, that his armies were not invincible.
And I wonder how Eylau might have impacted Napoleon's thinking, his approach to warfare moving forward. Did this experience change him in any way?
That's a good question, and it's hard to say for certain, but, Eylau does seem to mark a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. It's the beginning of a trend we see of these increasingly costly victories.
Right.
His enemies, especially the Russians, learn a crucial lesson. They can withstand the might of the Grande Armée.
Right.
They can inflict heavy casualties. They can make him pay dearly for every inch of ground.
So Eylau wasn't just about the immediate tactical outcome. It really had a ripple effect shaping the future course of the Napoleonic Wars.
Absolutely.
It emboldened his enemies, it exposed the vulnerabilities of the Grande Armée, and maybe even foreshadowed Napoleon's eventual downfall.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, Did this battle, with its just unprecedented brutality and the staggering losses on both sides, did it sow the seeds for Napoleon's ultimate defeat?
Right.
It's something to ponder as we reflect on this often overlooked but incredibly significant moment in history.
Yeah, it's been such a fascinating deep dive exploring a battle that often gets overshadowed by Napoleon's, more glorious triumphs. But Eylau really reveals this different side to Napoleonic warfare, a darker, more brutal side.
Yeah, definitely.
It reminds us that even the greatest military geniuses can face setbacks, that victory often comes at a terrible cost, and that the human cost of war is always just so profound.
And it really forces us to think about the nature of leadership, the limits of power, and, that unpredictable course of history. Eylau might not have been a decisive victory in that traditional sense, but it certainly had a lasting impact on Napoleon, on his enemies, and on the broader trajectory of the Napoleonic Wars.
Well, thank you so much for, guiding us through this journey to the heart of the Battle of Eylau.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
I think we've all gained a much deeper appreciation for this really complex and often overlooked chapter of history.
Good.
So until next time, keep exploring and keep asking those thought-provoking questions.